Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, the #1 professional resource for evidence-based practice in speech-language pathology. I'm Kate Granbois.
And I'm Amy Wonka. We are both speech-language pathologists working in the field and co-founders of SLP Nerdcast.
Each episode of this podcast is a course offered for ASHA CEUs. Our podcast audio courses are here to help you level up your knowledge and earn those professional development hours that you need. This course, plus the corresponding short post-test, is equal to 1 certificate of attendance. To earn CEUs today and take the post-test after this session, follow the link provided in the show notes or head to slpnerdcast.com.
Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Our courses are not meant to replace clinical advice. We do not endorse products, procedures, or other services mentioned by our guests unless otherwise specified.
We hope you enjoy the course.
Are you an SLP or related professional? The SLP Nerdcast Unlimited subscription gives members access to over 100 courses offered for ASHA CEUs and certificates of attendance. With SLP Nerdcast membership, you can earn unlimited CEUs all year at any time. SLP Nerdcast courses are unique, evidence-based, with a focus on information that is useful. When you join SLP Nerdcast as a member, you'll have access to the best online platform for continuing education in speech and language pathology. Join as a member today and save 10% using code NERDCASTER10. The link for membership is in the show notes.
Hi there, my name is Corey Clements. I'm the SLP Nerdcast Resource Specialist. It's my job to help you link research and practice. I seek out resources that are rooted in evidence and bring them to your fingertips. You can head on over to our resource library and check out all the available resources we already have for you. You can find me at resources@slpnerdcast.com. I can't wait to help you link research and practice.
This episode is a bit different than our typical episode. This episode is part of a conference called SLP Linked. The focus and purpose of SLP Linked is to connect research directly with practice. Each session as part of this conference will discuss what research looks like in our therapy rooms. Our goal is to bring you this content at least once every year to help you bring research into your therapy spaces and bring you therapy activities and ideas from the researchers themselves. Stay tuned for more information about the conference, but for now, on to the episode. Welcome, everyone, to the first session of SLP Linked. We're so happy to be here. This conference has been a long time in the making and grew out of a lot of conversations that took place between the people who are on this panel here this morning. We're really excited to talk about everything from the research to practice gap, power differentials between researchers and clinicians, the real world struggles that clinicians have in terms of finding therapy materials, choosing therapy materials. And I'm really excited to get started. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I think we're going to get started by introducing everyone. So would you all like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Chelsea Prevet. I am an assistant professor at University of Texas at Austin. I am an SLP. My background is in sociolinguistics, and so that really frames the way I approach my research and approach my practice as well. My research focuses on culturally sustaining assessment, particularly with preschoolers and kindergartners who are in culturally and linguistically diverse communities.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Beth Schmidt, and I am an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I am a longtime SLP, have worked with children in the public schools and in private sectors for the better part of 25 years now, which is hard to believe. I run the Children's Language and Literacy Lab at UT, where our research focuses on identifying best practices for working with children with language impairments in the public schools and working alongside SLPs, educators, and families to really support kids. And I'm also the editor of EBP Briefs, which is a free and open access journal online for clinicians.
And for everyone who is new here to SLP Nerdcast, I am one of the regular co-hosts I have a private practice outside of Massachusetts. I've been an SLP for over 15 years, but under 20, somewhere in the 17, 18 range. Honestly, I can't remember. And I have been, I'm also a dually certified BCBA, and the vast majority of my experience has been working in AAC in private practice, doing consulting and doing some consulting to substantially separate educational programs. And I'm here with my regular co host, Amy. We've been at this for a while now. Amy, why don't you, for any newcomer, what can you say
We
about
have.
yourself?
Yeah, so I had the good fortune of going last, so I got to do the math. Turns out I've been an SLP for 18 years. Feels like a long time. Of that time, the majority of the time I've been working in school-based settings. So I have a lot of non-public and public school experience, as well as some outpatient stuff. That's where I met Kate way back in the day, and I'm excited to be here with this group of people, and have this conversation because it's a really exciting and important one to have.
So, before we get into all the good stuff, we do need to go through our financial and non financial disclosures as well as our learning objectives. Chelsea, why don't you kick us off with our disclosures?
Yes, so my financial disclosures are I am employed full-time at UT Austin, so they pay me a salary. I am also receiving compensation for this presentation today, and my non-financial disclosures are I am a member of ASHA, SIG 14, SIG 1, and also the National Black Association for Speech, Language, and Hearing.
My financial disclosures, I'm an associate professor at UT Austin, where I receive a salary, and I am receiving compensation for this presentation. Non-financial, I'm a member of ASHA.
And Kate, that's me, my financial disclosures. I am the owner and founder of Grandbois Therapy and Consulting LLC and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures, I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and I serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy.
All right, Amy, that's me. My financial disclosures are that I am an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. And my non-financial disclosures are that I am a member of ASHA Special Interest Group 12, which is AAC, and I participate in the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children.
All right, learning objectives for the day. Learning objective number 1, explain the research to practice gap for service delivery to children in the public schools. Learning objective number 2, describe the purpose of selecting appropriate materials informed from research. And learning objective number 3, identify the value and limitations of appropriate materials with regard to children's treatment outcomes. All right, so we figured it would be a good idea to kick off this conversation by talking about why we're even here. Why did we create this conference? Why is this conversation important for us to have? We thought it would be a good idea for each of us to sort of start by talking about why we feel this is important. Mary Beth, do you want to start?
Sure. Honestly, I think I see so much of myself in this conversation, and have appreciated all the conversations that have got us here, right? Of this, I never in 1,000 years anticipated that I would go back to school and get my PhD. That's not what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to do clinical service delivery, and got to a point where I wasn't seeing me or my students reflected in the research, and I just was more and more bothered by it. And so finally did take the plunge, went back to school to learn how to do like applied research. And now that I'm doing the research, like I'm bothered by the power differentials, right? Now that I have this PhD, right, that doesn't give me special knowledge. It gives me a different contribution to the profession, but not better. It's not better. And yet I don't think that's the message that a lot of us as SLPs hear. It's not what I heard when I was a clinician. It was like, I knew my stuff, but I didn't know that. And now that I'm standing in the research world, I'm really bothered by this gap, this differential of power, and prioritizing of expertise, that's just not effective for kids. And so I'm so glad to be here and being a part of the conversation and figuring out, just how we can better serve each other and the students that we serve.
I guess I come to this conversation having been a person who has like kind of always found myself reading the research because I was looking for the answers in the research, and because maybe I'm just a smidge of a perfectionist and wanted to do my absolute best job, and I was looking to the experts to tell me what that absolute best job would be, and what that would look like for my clients. And I think, I have had mixed success with being able to read a paper and then figure out how to make that happen in a therapy room, or how to make that happen in a classroom. And I think sometimes it happened more easily than others. I have struggled with seeing my actual clients represented in the research. So and I've struggled with just the actual volume of research and not being able to read all of the things that are out there, and struggling with finding which one happens to be the best fit because you can't always tell from the title or the abstract. Um, so I'm really excited to be having this conversation because I think probably like most of the people listening, but we're going to do our best work when we're doing our work together with clinicians and researchers, because like you said, Mary Beth, you have different, you do have expertise. It's just different expertise than my expertise, and it's obviously going to be best if we're able to collaborate and learn from one another.
So similar to Mary Beth, I didn't go into becoming an SLP thinking I would become a researcher. Um, but while I was getting my master's, there were some things that I saw out on my practicum that really bothered me about the lack of information clinicians had, in terms of serving children from minoritized racial and linguistic communities. And so that was my first step into research. My mentors encouraging me to do a research project about that. And so that's why I continued on to get my PhD. But then while I was getting my PhD, I had professors who would say pretty demeaning things about SLPs as if they knew what was best and if SLPs should just get it together and do what the research says. And I was like, I never want to be that person. And so um, I went straight into my doctoral coursework straight from my master's program. So it was after I did my PhD coursework that I did my CF before I did my dissertation. And so having that experience of doing my CF after having all of this research training and then being in a school um, that was very large and very bilingual and not having the time and resources that I needed in order to practice the way I had been taught. That is something that that always stays with me and something that really drew me into this conversation when Kate first approached me about it. And doing that CF and trying to access the research in a way that was helpful for what I was doing in the moment and not, despite my training, not being able to consume the research in a way that I felt was applicable to me. And so I carry that with me into my research to really be mindful of the kinds of questions that I'm asking and the way that I write up my research and what I publish, because I do want it to be something that is helpful. And um, that is often not the case when we look at research articles. And so I am excited about this conversation to to grapple with this research to practice gap, because there's so much that goes into it and there's so much to be said about it, um, and these are the kinds of conversations that I hope continue to happen, because we're not going to come to some magical conclusion at the end of this. But I think this is the start of something, of a conversation that needs to continue and always be between researchers and clinicians, and even blurring that line about what it means to be a clinician versus a researcher.
Here to all of that. I think each of you touched on a little piece of one of the reasons that I'm here. Through this project of SLP Nerdcast, I have learned a lot, so much more about the research practice gap than I ever thought existed. So in graduate school, throughout my whole career, it's like, oh yeah, the research practice gap, like that's a problem, yada yada. But I go about my day, get my stuff out of the speech closet, worry about my schedule, argue with my boss about my PTO. Like I'm at my job, I'm living my life. And I know that this research practice gap, or had known that this research practice gap was a problem. But through this project, this SLP Nerdcast project, and having had the opportunity to talk to and interview so many researchers and having access to so much more information, the first thing that happened that really sparked in me that this was such a big problem was the statistic that the research to practice gap is 17 years long. It takes 17 years for a piece of research to become published and then become commonplace in routine clinical settings. And that statistic horrified me. And having, sort of learned more about what is involved in that gap. So it's not just that that our students aren't involved in the research. It's not just that clinicians should read more research and it's our fault, and this power differential between researchers and clinicians. And it's not just that the research isn't even written for us. And it's not just that the research doesn't necessarily have clinical takeaways. It's also that we have insanely high caseloads. It's also that we are working against articles being behind paywalls. There are innumerable variables that are contributing to this problem. And each of you we've done such a great job already just listing them, just everything that you all said in being here. And I want to give a special shout out to Natalie Douglas and Kathy Binger, who are two researchers who originally pointed parts of these problems out to us. And something that Natalie said really stuck with me, which was that if clinicians have any sense of guilt related to this research practice gap problem, that we should just be reading more, or we should just be understanding more. That what she said was that we should be absolutely absolved of that guilt, because this problem is so much bigger than what is shown to us, particularly in graduate school.
Here to that. And I would say too, in addition to that it's not just the SLPs to carry, like some of our research that we won't unpack directly here, but it has direct impact on SLPs, but it's really policy related, right? It's the administrators and our legislators that need to hear the research to change the landscape for SLP. So yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. But then here's one nugget. And when we first started, trying to talk about this conference, the reality that when it comes to materials, we don't have research on what's better to use just from a material standpoint, other than maybe with books. But in fact, we laughed about it. I was a part of a large descriptive study of just looking at, like, let's look at what SLPs are doing that's already working, right? Before we start as researchers trying to go in and tweak everything, like SLPs are working hard and the kids are benefiting as a result. Like, let's just take snapshots of what they're already doing. And we kind of laughed with the SLPs on our team of, what if we do all of this and it boils down to using felt boards? Like the one thing to help promote student progress is felt boards. And that was just kind of our inside joke, but no, really, like we actually looked at the materials that SLPs were using and tried to figure out if there was one material that was a better avenue for children's outcomes, and we haven't found it yet. So in addition to the being absolved of guilt, there's actually no research to help inform what it is we're doing on a day-to-day basis from a material standpoint.
And I just want to add about the absolving of guilt. And I know this, we talked about this being a different conversation, but I just want to acknowledge it here that there is a lot about the culture and the norms around research that makes it hard for researchers to do work that is more directly beneficial to clinicians. And it goes back to this hierarchy that we've constructed around who has the knowledge, and what kind of knowledge is valued and what gets published. And I think that's important for clinicians to know as well. It's a conversation that needs to happen among researchers, but I think clinicians who are not researchers should also know that there are barriers in the research world that make it hard to do the work that clinicians are looking for, and that some of us as researchers want to do.
I think that's really helpful. So that makes me think about how even when the research is out there and we find it, it doesn't necessarily directly map onto our students and their needs. And what that means is it's really hard for me as a clinician who's in a school environment when the research was done in a lab somewhere at a university and I don't have access to the materials that they used in the study. It's really hard for me to translate, even when I'm trying to translate the research into my practice. And so hopefully, Chelsea, folks like you who are dedicated to doing more research that does directly translate to clinicians. I hope that you're able to do that.
I also really appreciated learning how many barriers you all face as researchers. I had absolutely no idea. I think I went through my entire career thinking, well, I should just read the research. What is the research? That's the pinnacle, right? That's what I'm striving for. What everyone is talking about in the ivory tower of science that I'm not allowed in, and the pieces of information that come trickling down from it, I should know those. I should be reading them. I had no idea what the competitive nature of getting grants and publishing at a certain pace, or the pressure to do research that is not necessarily that helpful to clinicians. I know we've had a lot of conversations behind the scenes about the culture of research and how that impacts this, and I think it's really helpful. It was helpful for me to know that the problem was faced on both ends, the researcher facing end as well as the clinician facing end. I also wanted to address something, Mary Beth, I think you mentioned just about or maybe you both mentioned, Mary Beth and Chelsea, about the materials. And it made me reflect on the title of this talk, Caribou or Secret Square, right? When you open your closet as a clinician and you're planning for your 2 o'clock session and you're sitting there needing to choose what you're going to do for the day, are those the moments when we're not thinking about the article that we just read because we're trying to get through our session from 2 to 3 o'clock, or we're trying to choose something that the child might be really interested in? Or depending on your work environment, are you, working with really limited resources and you don't have Caribou or Secret Square? All you've got is an old deck of cards and three of them are missing. There's a lot of realistic and logistical barriers for us as clinicians in terms of implementing this science. And that is exactly why we are here, trying to talk about what science looks like, what research looks like in practice, regardless of all of these barriers. I don't know if from a researcher's lens, there are things that you'd like to shed light on, and things that you would like to highlight in terms of what those materials present. And maybe this is sort of starting to touch on our next learning objective, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
For me, recently, when you were just talking, it made me think of some comments that I got back on a paper that I have under review right now. And I don't know, I might get into trouble for talking about this, but the comment was about my materials where I had started the study in a preschool setting, and then COVID hit. And so I started doing home visits. And so I bought my own materials that were similar to the materials in the preschool, because one of the things that I knew the reviewers were going to be looking for was consistency with materials. And they still had a problem with the fact that the materials weren't exactly the same and the setting wasn't exactly the same. And the reason that comment bothered me so much is because the whole purpose of the study was to understand how the assessment protocol I was implementing um, worked in a community-based way, right? And that is more consistent with what a clinician encounters in the field, where you don't always have a clinic room to yourself. You don't always have the same materials for every session. You're not always in a quiet environment, right? And I wish that more people saw the value in publishing things that have that kind of variability, because those are the kinds of things that um, will help demonstrate that feasibility of the things that maybe start in that university clinic, like Amy was talking about, but need to be adapted to the whole range of settings and circumstances that clinicians encounter.
I think it's so funny and yet must have been very frustrating to get that feedback when that's the whole point. Because yeah, if the disruption, and again, not a researcher, my clinicianness is showing, but if you can't translate to very similar materials, then how am I as a clinician reading your paper supposed to translate it to my materials, which are probably even more different? Um, I do feel like we should take a second to just because there are a lot of problems as we've outlined here. There are a lot of challenges, and I think we're all familiar with it. But given all of those challenges and given all of those barriers that are currently in place that both researchers and clinicians are kind of working in our own spheres to try and resolve, um, what are the benefits? Like why should we engage in this struggle or challenge in order to use the research-based findings as much as we can in our clinical settings, in our school-based settings, because there are reasons to do it. There are benefits.
Amy, thank you. Thank you for that point. Because right, it's we're dogging on research, but actually there's a lot of benefits to it. Even when it's imperfect, right? So Chelsea, to your point of um we are held to a standard as researchers to make sure that the research we put out is done well, right? There's expectations and standards of research, and that's a good thing, right? When we think about research in terms of like the medical community, I want my physicians to not only or the ones doing the medical research to be doing it well so that we can trust it and go off of it. And so same for our discipline. Like we want to make sure we're putting out research that has been conducted in a rigorous way so that consumers can trust it. And so like Chelsea with yours, right? The goal or the focus of the research wasn't the activity, right? That was a piece of it. But the larger question at hand, like that's what as clinicians, and I'll speak for myself, like I'm hoping our research does is like gives you one nugget to take away, maybe in its imperfect form, to really empower what you're doing with clients, because it's a lot. I remember feeling the burden as a clinician that the decisions really rested on my expertise and my decision making. And sometimes what I'm doing aligns with the research, right? Like research comes out and it's like, oh, I was doing that, but I didn't even realize that there was a name or that I need to be doing more of that. But sometimes the research spotlights an aspect of clinical practice that either we hadn't thought about before, or contradicts what we have understood to be true about service delivery. And so not only are there benefits to research, I think there's an obligation to be considering new research to make sure that that in our clinical service delivery, right, we're not just stuck kind of doing what we've always done because we don't know any different, but considering these other things. But ultimately, I think the benefit is one of empowerment, that SLPs aren't just relying on their experience, which counts for a ton, but actually coming alongside clinicians to support what are you already doing, and then what are some avenues of supporting our students or our clients, which is the ultimate good, in supporting their progress.
And without the research, what are we even doing? Right. I mean,
Right.
without the research, this isn't science. It's not therapy. So, I mean, just to sort of zoom way back out again and think about this whole problem and why we're here, and thinking about every single clinician who is here with us today, who is listening at home, who is going to go to work on Monday and go into
Yeah.
the speech closet or look at their schedule or try to plan the day, and is tasked with putting research into practice, and all of the barriers that lead up to that moment for that clinician, all of the
Yeah.
barriers that the researchers faced to get that publication, to deal with those reviewers, to make the science-based decisions, to meet that responsibility, to bring science to our field, coupled with all of the barriers that the clinicians face to get access to what is in that research that could even be applied, much
Right.
less do we have the materials and the time to apply it. And I think that's a really nice segue into the next thing we wanted to talk about, which is that moment when you're standing in the speech closet tasked with this job of choosing a material, and how do you put research into practice. And part of that is what you plan in your therapy sessions. And I know behind the scenes, we've had a lot of conversation about what materials are, what materials aren't, how we go about choosing things, what variables are important to consider, what things are not important to consider. As a side note, one of the other things that we've talked about offline that I'm sure we're going to address today is the industry, right? So everybody knows what Super Duper is. Everybody knows what Lakeshore is, right? Especially if you're working in a school. So what are the industrial components related to this in terms of what we have access to? And I wondered if we wanted to sort of unpack what materials are and are not by looking at what the science says about materials. Researchers?
I wonder if we should start with evidence-based practice. Because I can read on the
That's
bullet
you,
that there's
Maybeth.
something about evidence-based practice. What is that? Maybe a quick snippet about that would be helpful.
Yeah. Okay. So, what materials are not? They are not EBP. So evidence-based practice is a process, not a product. Or I've said a different way, it's a verb, right? EBP happens inside your head. So there's not one material that is EBP. And beware of this when you're looking to spend your own hard-earned money, right, to get materials. It is used often as a marketing strategy. Often, hey, this set of cards is an evidence-based material to work on XYZ. No, it's not. It's not. It is a material. Now, could you use that material in your therapy session as a component of your EBP process? Absolutely. Absolutely. But EBP is in your head. That's the wrong terminology. It is in your head. It's not made up in your head. It's a process that's internal to you as a clinician. You are the one who is considering your client's needs, your experience, your data, and the external research in making individualized decisions for your clients. And there is no one material that will usurp that decision-making process from you.
One of the things that you have said in a previous conversation, Mary Beth, that stuck with me that I really like the way you put it. You said materials matter and they don't. Like they matter to the extent that they support your process, that they support the outcomes that we want for our clients. Um, but you can do that with a lot of different materials if you have the right strategies in mind. And one of the things that we were talking about before is that we have these materials as tools, right? The materials are the tools, they're not the therapy, right? We do the therapy. We look for what research there is out there about um, a particular area of practice, a particular goal, a particular disorder. But the principles that come from that are what matter. And there are materials that are tailored to particular goals, and there are materials that are not, but it doesn't really matter whether they are or whether they're not, because when you know what the principle behind the evidence base is, it doesn't matter whether it's marketed for a particular purpose or not. You can use that. And knowing the limitations of the resources available to a lot of SLPs, particularly in the school setting, is sometimes you don't have anything, that's being
Yeah.
marketed for a particular goal or outcome. There have been times where I have pulled out a stack of sticky notes and a marker and have made my materials as I go, like right there with the child. But I was doing evidence-based practice. I didn't have the
That's
kit
right.
that I bought from the business with the fancy cards or, the manipulatives and all of that. But that marker and that stack of sticky notes, I still did the therapy
Yeah.
the way that the therapy was outlined in the research.
I want to piggyback on that with the concept of being an informed consumer and being a critical thinker about what we are consuming. Because as you were talking, I was thinking about one set of materials in particular that is advertised as, and I quote, backed by research, right? So this is, I think, as we're the metaphorical SLP standing in the speech closet trying to figure out what to do, we need to be really critical thinkers about the marketing that is given to us, about the information that is given to us, particularly when there is so much information that we consume through social media, through marketing campaigns. And I think it's a really important thing to think about when you see wording like that that says backed
Yeah.
by research. There is a difference between something being backed by research and being informed by research, right?
Mm.
And I know it's a very slight turn of splitting hairs, but words really matter when we think about the materials that we are choosing standing in our metaphorical speech closet. And I wonder, planning our day, I wonder if that's a nice segue into talking about what materials are, right? So, what is that informed by research versus backed by research? When we see something that might be facilitated or might facilitate a research finding, what are the contextual components that are really important when we're thinking about what materials to choose?
Kelsey, it made me smile that you used the example of the post-it notes and the marker, because I had a professor when I was a master student, graduate student. And she said, she was making this point, right? Really empowering us as EBP is what you do. You are here in graduate school to learn the process. We can't give you a manual and say, here, go do this, because you wouldn't need a master's degree for that. Right? Like it's how do you think critically with all these pieces? And so she said, she's like a seasoned master clinician can do therapy with any client, any goals, any age, any disorder, with a piece of paper and a pencil. And
Absolutely.
she wasn't saying don't use any other materials, right? Like that's not what she was saying, but it stuck with me so much. And so, like, when we're looking at that closet, right, and trying to choose the materials, it helped me when I was actively working as an SLP or as a clinician to see all of those choices as blank slates, right? They were pieces of paper and pencils because what happened in that therapy session was this dynamic relationship between me and the client. And so those materials um, become a context builder or they contextualize whatever it is we're working on that day. But the
Mhm.
power, the therapeutic process, that's happening between the client and I. And so I've always appreciated that she said that, and then remembering it now kind of metaphorically. Like I may be pulling out Caribou, but for this client, Caribou might as well be a blank piece of paper and a pencil.
I love that. I love that about thinking about materials as a blank slates. Because and you just alluded to this. At the end of the day, we're working on communication, and communication happens between people.
Yeah.
Communication is about the relationship. And so you can use the materials, like you said, as a context builder around that. But the way that you use those materials should be informed not only by the research, but also by your client and what your
Yeah.
client's um, desires are and their needs are and their perspective is. And I think one of the things that we often forget, especially with people diagnosed with communication disabilities, and particularly with children, is we underestimate what they have to say about their experience and about
Yeah.
um, how they experience the world, how they experience school, what they think about their language, what matters to them. But they have a lot to tell us about the context that we need to build around the therapy environment.
Yeah.
Chelsea, I really appreciate that point that you made. I think, I sit here as somebody who agrees that materials alone don't make an evidence based session, but I feel super strongly that the right materials make a huge difference in terms of a successful session or a not successful session. And so much of that has to do with the other person or people who are part of that interaction with you and understanding their preferences and values and what matters and what's engaging for them. And, I mean, again, because we're thinking about school, it also might mean thinking about the teachers and thinking about maybe pre-teaching some vocabulary that's connected to the curriculum. So having materials that do help facilitate your evidence-based practice is not a bad thing, right? I think that for me,
Right.
the distinction is the materials alone do not make evidence-based practice. You
Hmm.
can have materials that are oriented to your goals and outcomes and not be doing evidence-based practice. And you can have materials that aren't in any way oriented toward it and be doing excellent evidence-based practice. But you
Hmm.
can also have the alternative, and you can have materials that maybe connect exactly with what your students will be doing in science later that day, and are
Yeah.
connected with the ultimate outcome and still be doing evidence-based practice. So it's really
Yes.
understanding that there's a whole continuum of material and EBP intersections, and you want to make sure you're
That's
always
right.
falling on the side of EBP, no
That's right.
matter what your materials are. But I also think student interest and engagement is such an important piece.
I also want to give a head nod, piggybacking off of what you just said, Amy, about the reality and logistics related to materials. So I was thinking, for example, of, and at the SLP who's driving between multiple buildings. Or, this one kiddo loves this very large pretend pig, but I can't fit it in my bag. So
Right.
I'm going to have to come up with something else when I get to that new building. I had a professor in graduate school who used to say therapy is a science and an art. There
Yeah.
are components of this that we need to be creative, and sometimes the materials do matter because of logistics, because of what we have available, because I have too many sessions today, or I have a caseload that's insane, and the cognitive load that it's going to take me to be super creative in this moment is maybe going to just, it's not doable. It's not feasible. So sometimes being able to pull something off a shelf that facilitates EBP for me or is in line with that EBP can be a really important thing to consider just based on the logistics and limitations of our resources and our jobs. It's making me also think about something we've talked about offline related to how materials need to facilitate our objectives, right? I mean, they need to be congruent with the goals that we have for our students. One of the examples that we've talked about a lot is if you're working with an oral motor speech, um, a child whose objectives are related to motor learning, you need to pick something that's going to give you high repetitions because we know that the research says that you need high repetitions. Doesn't mean it has to be one game over another, but you got to pick something that's going to facilitate that objective.
Right. No, that's right. And Kate, I think all of what you said, I 100% agree. And it just circles back to that idea of the materials work for you and your client, right? You're not working for that. And so it's just that idea of, yeah, whatever's driving the decision, whether it's a combination of like what Chelsea's saying, motivation and interest and or logistics, you know, limited funding, you know, to get all of the different things that making sure we're not putting too much emphasis or relinquishing too much power to the materials because they work for you in whatever way you need. And so I think maybe I hope that's an encouraging component, right? That there's not a perfect material out there, or if there is, we haven't found it yet. We don't know what that is. And so there's a lot of flexibility then as the clinician to make well-informed decisions for you and your client.
Which is a beautiful segue to our last learning objective related to values and limitations. Look at that. It was like you planned it.
Sometimes it works well.
One of the things that we talked about a lot in leading up to this conversation was about the value of materials and how they need to be well matched to our learners' needs. And we've already talked about how it needs to be aligned with their interests and their values. Motivation is a really big factor. I know I gave the example of like the giant stuffed pig. You're choosing things that are going to get your kids excited about being in therapy with you. But there are other variables as well. We need to make sure we're choosing materials that are aligned with their sensory and motor needs. We need to be making sure we're choosing materials that are not only aligned with the research and facilitate the components of research and science that we're aware of, but they also would need to be well matched to their skill level. And, that can be a really delicate balance when you're working under difficult working conditions or working with limited resources.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's really tricky. And, this is why as clinicians, your value is can't be understated, right? Of like all of the decisions that are going into therapy, but thinking about, I think it's an important point, Kate, of not just the objectives, but just how your learners can even interact with the materials, and then thinking too about how they see themselves. Chelsea, you hit on this a minute ago of what their views are with their own like linguistic systems and what their goals are and what they're wanting to get out of therapy. And so part of the value reminds me of what you were saying with that.
Yeah, and I also want to add to that and say that sometimes, and this kind of speaks to a conversation that Kate and Mary Beth were having earlier offline about the difference between fun and motivation. And you
Yeah.
all may want to say more about this, but um, oh, we would like for students to have fun when they're with us, and we want therapy to be fun, but sometimes the things that we work on aren't necessarily fun, but that doesn't mean that they can't be motivating. But the thing that I wanted to add about um, about understanding students' experiences is that sometimes we make assumptions about what a particular kind of child would like or not like, or based on their age, is, oh, I'm sure they'll love this game because kids this age love this game. Um, that is not always the case. And particularly when we think about kids from varying cultural backgrounds, what is motivating to them, that's something that maybe you have no idea about. And so you
Yeah.
need to find out what that is, either from the client or the family or whatever it may be. But understanding that your idea of fun and motivation may not fit uh, a child's or a family's idea about what that means, and being able to adapt in that way as well.
That's good. It reminds me of a PhD student who is completing their CF right now, and they're working with middle schoolers. And um, they were sharing this experience with one group, and the students just said, like, I don't even know why I'm here. Right. And so the CF engaged them of like, let's talk about it. Right. Like, here's what your goals are. Do you know what that means? Right. And had this really, really authentic conversation. And the student was able, because the CF allowed it, right, to voice what they needed, and then shifted the focus of the sessions to be very academic. Right. They were bringing in homework and bringing in the textbook, and nothing about that looked fun. But it clicked now for the student of like, you can help me with that. Right. And not that the SLP before hadn't been helping, but it was under this guise of like, well, I have to make it fun because otherwise this middle schooler is not going to want to come. And all the while, the middle schooler's like, this has no bearing on my life, no relevance. Why am I being pulled out of class? And so I think that story really emphasizes what I heard from you, Chelsea, of let's ask our students, like, let's give them a lot of credit for understanding who they are and their needs, and then matching that with the materials that we choose.
I love this story. I love this story. I think it's a great example of making sure that the therapy we provide, including the materials that we choose, are aligned with person-centered care, are
Yeah.
aligned with values, are adding value, are making our client feel empowered. It also made me think about just what we need to think, how we need to measure what we're doing in our sessions, the data that we need to collect in our sessions. And sometimes that data is, how are you feeling about therapy? The
Right.
information, the
Yeah.
information that we are getting is not always the valuable information is not always tally marks on a spreadsheet, or the number of percent correct trials. A lot of the information that will drive our therapy and inform our therapy is related to some of those softer data components. Someone said something to me once that I repeat to myself on a daily basis, and I know I've said it on the podcast before, is that failure is data. So if you prepare something for a session, you get your Caribou, your secret square out, or you get something that you think that middle schooler is going to think is fun, and it flops, that's great news. That is good
Yeah.
information for me to
That's right.
have, because it is data that is going to inform and shape my therapy session next time for whatever reason. Um, it also makes me think about the importance of the data collection and this data that we're gathering as part of our evidence-based practice triangle, right? So our evidence-based practice triangle is this three-pronged approach of client and patient values and perspectives, clinical judgment, and then evidence. We always think of evidence as this external evidence of research, but the internal evidence, the data that we're collecting
Yeah.
to inform our treatment, is massively important. And sometimes that's related to what we're choosing to do. And sometimes it's related to the games or the activities that we've prepared.
And I would add too, we talk so much about data collection, but there's also if you collect the data and it just sits on your Post-it notes on the side of your desk and don't review it and analyze it. And I say this as someone who's done this. I've collected in my career massive amounts of data that I went back to when I had to, when it was progress reporting time. And by then I've potentially missed a window of time in which I could have picked up on the fact that something I was doing actually wasn't working, even if I thought that I was engaging in evidence-based practice because I had read an article that inspired me to do the activities I was doing. And so therefore it should have been working. Just because we read a research article about something and have that external evidence doesn't mean it's going to translate perfectly and that our clients are going to see great success. So that analysis and review of the data is really helpful. And for me, I've changed the way I collect some of my data to make it more simplified because that makes it more likely that I will actually look at it and review it and consider it. So I think those are
Smart.
such great points as far as, like it could literally just be data about these activities don't seem to be successful. But asking yourself those clinical questions on an ongoing basis and really taking a few seconds, even just at the beginning of the session, to look at your previous data sessions with that client, I think is also super important.
And Kate, you said something else that reminded me of a student that I had who I started out using like the official materials for this goal, like the cards for complex syntax or whatever it was. And this student was just not motivated, but the student loved to come in and talk about what was happening in class, and the student loved telling stories. And so finally, I let him tell his stories, and we started writing his stories, and that what became our materials. And so the student became the producer of the materials that we would then use in
I
therapy.
love
And
that.
so that also speaks to motivation, right? It was something
Totally.
that was coming from the student, and then things started to click, and we started to see progress.
I love that.
I also think that speaks to one of the other bullets we have here, which is generalization. So we really it's incredibly important for us as therapists to constantly be considering generalization. What we do in our tiny speech rooms is only as good as how it translates outside of our speech rooms. And if we're using materials that don't represent something functional or don't represent something that a student is going to be motivated to share outside of our speech room, then we're doing a really big disservice. I think this is a particularly important conversation when we're talking about settings that might prioritize a drill based approach to learning language where you're expected to produce high repetitions in response to this one particular card that's put on a table in front of you, right? That isn't necessarily going to help with generalization to producing that word at home or in the grocery store. And in those contexts, the materials that we choose matters. We need to be thinking
Yeah,
about functional application. We need to be thinking about generalization outside of our therapy rooms.
absolutely. And I think to your point, Kate, that kind of moves us back into that bigger picture, both with EBP, but also just all of the clinical decisions we're making, right? Of its materials, but it's also target selection, and it's also the objectives. It's also client motivation. Like we're having this specific conversation about the materials, but I think it's important that we remember there's this massive intersection of materials with all these other components that really drive the decisions being made for our students.
So we've talked a lot about the very real challenges that are present for clinicians and for researchers, but I think I'm feeling really optimistic about the fact that not having to use specific materials and just having to use evidence-based practice with whatever materials we identify as functional and meaningful and motivating for our clients is is doable. It's there are there's thought that has to go behind it, and it's an active engagement with our clinical skills. But we can do this and we can provide high quality services for our clients.
Absolutely. It's 100% doable, but it's also nuanced, right? Like we've unpacked a lot in this past hour of the all of the decision making that goes into how are we using materials for whom and in what capacity. And so I'm excited as part of this conference for the upcoming breakout sessions. And so that's really what we're going to do there is take these research nuggets that researchers are suggesting and activities for how to implement research, but unpacking that with the diversity of your caseloads, right? How do we actually take these materials, take these activities, inform from research, but apply them to our clients? So I've loved this conversation, but even more, I'm really looking forward to those breakout groups to make this super practical for clinicians.
And for us as
And for
researchers
yes.
to learn from clinicians, right? Because that's what makes our research better is learning from you all and like really elevating that knowledge.
Yes, we're not coming with all the answers, right? It's an ongoing conversation. Thank you, Chelsea. 100%. I agree.
I love talking with you all about this kind of stuff. And if anyone is listening or here with us live today and having any feelings or thoughts about all of the stuff that we've unpacked, if you are feeling like your job is difficult, be validated. It's hard. We're, in working conditions that are often unfair. We're, being given offices under the stairwell. We're having our budgets cut. A lot of us are feeling very frustrated with the conditions that we're working in, and we're all showing up at our workplaces to work with our students, to add value to their lives. And this research practice gap problem, or being tasked with putting research into practice, is not easy. And it is a very complex problem across the entire pipeline, starting with asking a research question. It is riddled with problems all the way up until you are standing in your speech office choosing between Caribou and Secret Square. So we're really looking forward to unpacking this more throughout the day today in our four researcher interviews and in the 2 breakout sessions where we're going to be talking about how to adapt these activities from research across skill level, modality, and cultural competency. So stay tuned. We're really looking forward to seeing everyone through the rest of the day. Mary Beth, Chelsea, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
This has been great. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you for attending this session of SLP Linked. ASHA CE processing and certificates of completion for SLP Linked are exclusive to SLP Nerdcast members. SLP Nerdcast members also receive access to live events, a downloadable series program, access to 2 bonus courses related to how to adapt these materials across modality, cultural competency, and skill level, as well as access to our speakers, content experts, and researchers through a private discussion board. If you have any questions about becoming an SLP Nerdcast member or you need any accommodations for this course, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thanks so much for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon.